Untouchable! Untouchable!
Never imagined that a single operation on Florida's quiet coastline would shatter so many assumptions I once held about smuggling in America. Yet the moment I reviewed the first report, the one confirming that 4 migrant boats had been intercepted just miles from our shore, I realized this wasn't a routine case. It was a revelation. 30 Chinese nationals, 5 Bahamians, and nearly 370 pounds of cocaine crammed together on vessels meant for leisure, not criminal transport. As I walked into the briefing room that morning, I could feel the weight of something larger pressing against the edges of the facts, a truth that this network wasn't just bold, it was global, calculated, and disturbingly efficient. From the very first moment, I sensed that this operation would force me to confront the darker corridors of international trafficking, where human lives and narcotics flowed along the same channels with ruthless precision. Their planning extended even further. The 3 boats involved in the operation were not chosen at random. 2 were meant to serve as decoys expected to draw attention from federal patrols, while the 3rd carried the highest value cargo. When law enforcement intercepted the first 2, the 3rd attempted to break away a maneuver that confirmed contingency plans were built directly into the operation. I couldn't help but admire in a grim way the level of intelligence behind even their failsafes. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy. The human element was equally complex. The Chinese nationals on board weren't merely smuggled bodies, they were investments. Many had paid more than their life savings in trusting criminal networks with dreams of opportunity that would never materialize. And yet, for the traffickers, these individuals were nothing more than data points, numbers on a ledger representing tens of thousands of dollars each. I found myself wondering what promises had been made to them, what illusions had convinced them to risk their lives on overcrowded boats in the darkness, what lies had been whispered to justify the price. There were deeper layers still. Financial records hinted at offshore payments, cryptocurrency transfers, and digital brokers who specialized in migration logistics. This was not a local scheme. It was a multinational enterprise using modern tools to fuel an ancient trade. Every detail from the Airbnb rental to the beach lookouts was part of a system designed to exploit loopholes in global mobility. As I reviewed the final documents of the pipeline structure, one question lingered like a shadow. If criminals could use the same technology, the same institutions, and the same conveniences that shape modern life, how could enforcement ever stay ahead? And more importantly, how many other pipelines equally sophisticated, equally silent, were already operating beyond our line of sight? As I continued piecing together the fragments of this operation, I found myself drawn deeper into the human cost hidden behind the data points and seizure reports. It was easy at first to view the migrants as part of the cargo numbers in an indictment entries in a manifest. But when I studied their profiles one by one, something shifted. These were individuals who had crossed oceans, surrendered their savings, and handed their futures to men who saw them only as revenue. Among them were 2 children, small, exhausted, and caught in a machinery they could never understand. I remember staring at their intake photos, troubled by the stark contrast between their innocence and the cold design of the smuggling pipeline that had exploited them. Their presence forced me to confront a truth I had long known, but rarely felt so acutely. Criminal profit thrives where human vulnerability exists. Every migrant had a story, even if they didn't speak it aloud. Many had flown into the Bahamas, legally believing they were purchasing a path to the United States. Smugglers had promised safe passage, rapid entry, and opportunities that gleamed brighter than the realities awaiting them. I thought of the parents who brought their children, risking everything for a dream, sold by criminals who cared nothing for their survival. Were they driven by desperation, manipulation, or misguided hope? As I sifted through the evidence, I realized that the line between victim and participant wasn't always clear, but the line between exploitation and profit certainly was. What startled me most was how organized this human trade had become. The smugglers operated like brokers in an international market. Prices were fixed $30,000 to $35,000 per person. Payments were prearranged through intermediaries who laundered funds across borders. The migrants were processed like commodities, transported, staged, counted, and shipped across maritime routes where their presence doubled as camouflage for the cocaine hidden alongside them. The 2 children I learned were intentionally placed aboard because smugglers believed that families were less likely to raise suspicion if stopped. It was a chilling calculation, reducing the lives of children to strategic shields. Yet as I studied the operation, I couldn't ignore another layer demand. The cocaine, 168 kilograms of it, had a destination, a buyer, and a value that dwarfed the earnings from smuggled migrants. Traffickers had discovered that combining human transport with drug shipments created a diversifying effect. If one cargo failed, the other might succeed. The more I analyzed the pattern, the clearer it became that the migrants were secondary, not the primary product, but an additional income stream in a far larger economy of illicit goods. This realization left a bitter taste. Human lives had become the bonus profit. But exploitation ran deeper than economics. Many migrants had been promised safety, but were placed on overcrowded boats, pushed into dangerous waters before dawn, and monitored by traffickers who would abandon them the moment danger appeared. Testimonies revealed threats, withholding of documents, and pressure tactics used throughout the journey. Some migrants believed they were being rescued. Others knew they were being smuggled and accepted the risks. In both cases, the criminals in charge cared only about the payout. As I absorbed all of this, I asked myself an uncomfortable question: was the desperation of these individuals truly the root cause, or was it the global system that allowed criminal networks to exploit loopholes, weak borders, and digital anonymity? The smugglers had weaponized hope, transforming it into currency, and the people who paid with their savings and sometimes their lives were merely the means. The operation's origins stretch back to an Airbnb in Fort Pierce, an image that still unsettles me. The idea that a place designed for vacations and family trips had been repurposed into a staging hub for smuggling felt like a metaphor for the modern criminal underworld. It hides in plain sight. The men involved booked the rental with the same casual ease as tourists planning a beach weekend, but their intentions were far from ordinary. Their plan was simple on paper: travel to the Bahamas, collect a batch of undocumented migrants and a significant drug load, and return before dawn. Yet behind that simplicity lay layers of complexity: international financiers, transport coordinators, digital communication channels, and a network of people who had long learned how to blend into legitimate systems. By the time I completed my review of the human dimension, one unsettling conclusion crystallized in my mind. What happened in Florida wasn't just a trafficking attempt, it was the outcome of a refined, industrialized system that turned human aspiration into financial fuel for international crime. And as long as that aspiration existed, the machinery would continue running with or without our intervention. As the scope of the operation became clearer, I found myself increasingly focused on the response: how law enforcement at every level converged to dismantle a network that had grown bold through years of adaptation. What impressed me first was the unity. In a landscape where agencies often struggle with jurisdictional overlap, resource competition, and communication failures, this operation achieved the opposite. It forged alignment. Local deputies, federal agents, Marine units, highway patrol officers, and interagency partners moved with a precision that mirrored the very coordination of the smugglers they pursued. I remember reviewing the operation timeline and feeling a rare sense of conviction. When American law enforcement is synchronized, its power is unmatched. The foundation of the success lay in relationships that had been rebuilt after years of fragmentation. Sheriff Richard Del Toro had spoken openly about how previous administrations had allowed partnerships with federal task forces to weaken. By the time he took office, his county had been severed from DEA initiatives, disconnected from FBI task forces, and absent from U.S. Marshals coordination. Rebuilding those ties wasn't just symbolic, it was operationally vital. The Florida smuggling case illustrated this truth in real time. Once the partnerships were restored, resources multiplied, intelligence flows improved, and when the moment came to act, the agencies moved like a single structure rather than isolated islands. The execution itself unfolded with a calm intensity. Marine units monitored the boats from their launch at 5:30 a.m., tracking their movements across the inlet. It still amazes me how seamlessly surveillance, marine interception, and ground coordination blended together. When the first two boats were intercepted, enforcement officers responded not with uncertainty, but with practiced confidence. They anticipated evasive maneuvers. The communication logs reflected no panic, no confusion, only rapid, decisive actions rooted in preparation. Even when the third boat attempted to flee, agents pivoted instantly, proving that experience and strategy outweighed the smugglers' contingency plans. Simultaneously, ground units executed parallel searches tied to the Airbnb staging location. The operation unfolded like a synchronized choreography: water interception, land detainment, digital seizure, and migrant processing, each element tied to the others. Reviewing the post-operation debrief, I couldn't help but appreciate how rare it is for multiple agencies, each with its own protocols, to operate with such coherence. What I witnessed in the report was not just enforcement, it was a disciplined counterstrike against a global threat. And yet the triumph came with sobering reflections. I found myself examining the layers of effort required to stop just one pipeline, weeks of intelligence gathering multiple agencies, dozens of officers, Marine Patrol assets, aerial support, and federal coordination. All of this to intercept 30 migrants, 5 Bahamian facilitators, and 370 pounds of cocaine. It forced me to confront the imbalance how criminals can deploy a pipeline with a handful of actors, yet dismantling it requires a near military level of mobilization. This asymmetry is one of the great challenges of modern trafficking. Still, the operation proves something essential: smugglers evolve, but so does American law enforcement. The coordination in Fort Pierce sent a message that echoed beyond Florida's coast. The reconstructed alliances between agencies became a blueprint. The rapid response demonstrated the value of shared intelligence, and the success validated what many within the system had been advocating for years: that only unified enforcement can stand against an international criminal infrastructure. As I considered the broader implications, I realized the operation had affirmed a principle that often gets lost in public debate. Strong borders do not exist solely at land crossings. They live in the coastline, in the airspace, in the cyber channels where communication flows. And the law enforcement officers who guard those borders, regardless of department or jurisdiction, must operate as one if they hope to counter the increasingly globalized nature of crime. Yet even in the wake of victory, one question grew louder in my mind: if this operation represented our best example of coordination, would we be able to replicate it consistently across states, across agencies, across unpredictable criminal networks evolving faster than our systems were designed to handle? As I stepped back to analyze the broader implications of the Florida operation, I began to understand that what we uncovered was not a singular event. It was a symptom of a shifting landscape. For years, the national conversation around smuggling had been dominated by the southern land border, and while that focus was logical, it had created a dangerous blind spot. When land routes tightened, especially under a renewed enforcement push, criminal organizations simply changed direction. They looked to the sea, they looked to the air, they looked for places where attention had faded. Florida's coastline, long treated as a picturesque boundary, had quietly become a new front line. The data painted a vivid picture of this transition. Land-based drug seizures dropped dramatically from 453 cases in July 2024 to just 33 by the same month in 2025. Yet maritime and air route interceptions surged, revealing a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Smugglers had found the path of least resistance international flights to the Bahamas, followed by short, lucrative maritime routes across clear water. It was a shift driven not only by enforcement but by technology. Criminal networks use digital communication, online travel booking, cryptocurrency payments, and real-time surveillance to create flexible routes that could adapt faster than many enforcement models. As I examined the evidence, I couldn't ignore how the smugglers exploited legal pathways. The Chinese nationals had flown to the Bahamas through entirely legitimate travel channels. From there, they were fed into a pipeline promising access to American soil for a staggering $30,000 or more per person. I remember pausing over photographs of the 2 children found on board, small, frightened, and silent reminders of how criminal greed devours innocence without hesitation. These weren't families fleeing persecution. This was organized exploitation. Those children had been turned into leverage collateral in a dangerous transaction that placed profit above humanity. What struck me most was how effectively these networks exploited global infrastructure. They used the same tools you and I use every day: Airbnb bookings, commercial flight paths, encrypted messaging apps. They blended their movements into the rhythms of ordinary life with such precision that detecting them required almost surgical coordination. When I reviewed the smuggling pattern in its entirety, the operation resembled a corporate supply chain more than a criminal plot. People, drugs, payments, and information moved through nodes, each designed to withstand disruption. If one route closed, another emerged. If one facilitator was arrested, a replacement was already prepared. This adaptability forced me to confront a difficult truth: modern trafficking has become a global logistics business. Borders no longer restrain it, geographic limitations no longer define it, and the old assumption that stopping a single pipeline would generate lasting impact now feels dangerously outdated. For every smuggling route we shut down, several others operate silently, strengthened by the lessons learned from previous interceptions. In this case, the Bahamas had become the new staging ground, not because the smugglers preferred it, but because its immigration policy policies and tourism-heavy infrastructure made it efficient and easy to exploit. Yet all of this came with a human cost that I could not ignore. The Chinese migrants who had paid tens of thousands of dollars found their dreams collapsing into detention, deportation, and financial ruin. The traffickers who promised them a future delivered only risk, deception, and exploitation. Their stories were fragments of a larger crisis, one in which hope becomes a commodity traded between continents. As I studied these patterns, I couldn't help but wonder how many more individuals were boarding planes to the Bahamas at that very moment, unaware that their journey was built on a foundation of criminal manipulation. The national implications were unavoidable. This was not merely a Florida story, it was an American story, a reflection of how domestic security is shaped by global forces, shifting migration patterns, and the relentless creativity of criminal enterprises. It pushed me to reconsider what border protection truly means. It is not a wall, a checkpoint, or a line on a map. It is a system of vigilance that must stretch across coastlines, airports, digital networks, and international partnerships. As I processed the final details of the operation, one question lingered deeply: if this was the level of sophistication we face today, what evolution would come next? What new routes would criminals forge in response to our actions? And more importantly, were we preparing fast enough for a future where smuggling no longer resembles anything we've seen before? The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this Florida bust wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger shift, one driven by geopolitical changes, tightened land borders, and the endless adaptability of criminal networks. In the past year, drug seizures along the southern land border had plummeted, but maritime interception surged. The criminals had simply changed direction like water flowing toward the easiest path, and Florida's coastline, long a symbol of paradise, had become a frontline battleground. What shocked me most wasn't just the coordination between smugglers, but the sophistication behind their counter-surveillance. They had stationed men along the beaches to watch for law enforcement reporting movements to the boat crews in real time. This was a tactic straight out of major organized crime playbooks. It proved that these weren't opportunists, they were professionals, and they were getting better with every operation. I had to ask myself, if this one network had already advanced this far, how many others were evolving right now, quietly slipping past our attention? As the details piled up, one conclusion became unavoidable. The Florida operation was not just a bust, it was a warning, a signal flare illuminating how deeply embedded these pipelines had become in both legitimate and criminal spheres. And as I prepared to follow the next stage of the investigation, one question echoed louder than the rest. If this was only one slice of the picture, what did the full landscape of modern smuggling truly look like, and were we prepared for it? The further I moved into the heart of the investigation, the more the smuggling pipeline revealed itself as an intricate machine, one far more advanced than anything I had encountered in previous cases. What struck me first was how seamlessly the operation blended into the fabric of everyday life. The Airbnb in Fort Pierce wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a headquarters. A command center disguised as a vacation rental where men gathered around kitchen counters and patio tables to coordinate an international trafficking route that stretched from China to the Bahamas and finally to Florida. As I pieced together their digital communications, I realized they weren't improvising. They had done this before. They used encrypted apps, burner phones, and coded messages that were subtle enough to avoid suspicion, yet precise enough to keep dozens of people moving in sync. The structure of the pipeline was chilling in its efficiency. Migrants were flown legally into the Bahamas, bypassing land borders that had become too restrictive. From there, smugglers arranged their passage onto boats already preloaded with cocaine. Combining human cargo with narcotics wasn't accidental. It maximized profit, minimized trips, and ensured that every mile traveled carried multiple revenue streams. As I studied their routes, I noticed how carefully they had chosen their launch points. Quiet coves, narrow inlets, and nighttime windows were all calculated to reduce detection. The smugglers treated Florida's coastline like a series of gates, knowing exactly which ones were the least guarded at specific hours. But what disturbed me most was the counter-surveillance apparatus they had set up. I examined photographs and drone footage of lookouts stationed along the beaches, men dressed like joggers or tourists holding phones and pretending to scroll while they scanned for law enforcement boats. The ease with which they blended in was a reminder that modern trafficking no longer hides in the shadows. It hides in the open, it adapts, it mimics, and it uses the same tools we do: Airbnb commercial flights, social media, GPS navigation to move people and drugs with terrifying dexterity.